So I'm very happy to be here today at the Africa Investor CEO Investment Summit. IFC and the World Bank are pleased to work in association with the Africa investors on this event. And we are looking forward to a good discussion over the next hour. Let me try to introduce my colleagues here. I have a very distinguished lineup. Let's see. I have on immediate left, Kodeja Diallo. She is director at the African Development Bank. I have after Alex Okosi, senior vice president and managing director of Viacom, International Media Networks Africa. Following Savannah Mazia, is that correct? From Budenji Group. We have I don't see. Oh, Hendrik Detroit, who is the CEO of Investec Asset Management. And I have our friend from the Nigeria Sovereign Wealth Fund. I don't. Uche, I'm not getting to pronounce, I don't see it well from here. So we'll continue. The large African companies are an issue that actually I discussed during the spring meeting. We discussed the panel earlier this year. So we'd like to review some of the thought I had at that time, and more importantly, think about these issues in a new way. For my own part, I took on a new role just a week ago. In my new role as IFC Vice President for Global Client Services, I am working to ensure that IFC is delivering more for our clients and also making sure that we are able to help them deliver more in the countries that need them most. And I have a special mandate to help increase IFC's business in economies that have been affected by conflict or are fragile. So I hope I can encourage some discussion around some of these issues on large companies. And also how financiers can really help African companies grow and reach further into difficult markets in a way that makes strong business sense for them. Just to set the tone, I would like to consider why Africa has so few large companies. African economies largely languished or suffered severe booms and busts for 5 decades prior to the dawn of the 21st century. Homegrown businesses couldn't thrive in poorly governed, unstable economies. During the recent decade, we have seen some progress. Africa has strong and growing businesses in most important sectors and key areas for growth. IFC is supporting African economies across a range of sectors, but there are just too few quality African companies, and they are only beginning to break out of their home markets. We are quite proud of the progress we are seeing among our African-based clients, especially as they move into neighboring markets and take advantage of declining trade barriers. A few examples, we have the ACFED group all over, not only across Africa, but also across Asia and other places. We have the SAFAL group in Kenya, Zambia, VEGPRO Kenya, Patisen Senegal, Dangote Group, etc. IFC's African clients demonstrate that African companies can expand and develop rapidly in these fast-growing markets. But it is not easy. Fast-growing African companies need to focus on governance and building management capacity. Today, African companies need to allow themselves to increase the scale of their businesses and gain capacity to operate across markets. Africa has made strides in reducing barriers to trade and investment, and this is a contributing factor to the high growth we are seeing today. Finally, I'd like to highlight one point that is, I think, quite striking when I was looking again at the list of homegrown companies. Of the top 100 African companies by turnover, only 12 are from outside South Africa. In other words, the difference, 88 are from South Africa. Those 12 are concentrated in natural resources, those which are out of South Africa. So Africa has very few manufacturing companies among its largest. frankly, it is not a surprise when we think about the high cost of some of the entrants. I mean, if you just took electricity, for example, I mean, if you want to build large big manufacturing operation, I mean, you have a lot of electricity, and we know that it's not competitive while we have the cost of electricity in our countries. But anyway, we won't dwell into that. And despite the importance of agriculture in the economies of Africa, there are very few agribusiness giants on the continent. Africa has a weak consumer economy. It's growing, but it's weak, and its large companies reflect that fact. South African companies dominate the retail sector. So I would like to, the panel to reflect on some of these issues today, and I'd like each of the panelists to also consider the following issues. What can and should large financiers be doing to help well-managed, promising companies move from small or medium companies to large ones? Then, given the likelihood of expanding companies to look to neighboring markets, what can we do to get African companies with big growth plans to move into and manage the risks associated with expansion into the poorest and most fragile neighboring states? So I guess I'm going to start. Given the time, I'm not going to be able to introduce the panelists. I guess if they have the opportunity to say a few words, they will say so. But let me try briefly with Khadija. Khadija, first of all, congratulations on your recent appointment as head of the African Development Bank Private Sector Department. As an institution and heading a department dedicated to investing in and supporting the growth of the African private sector, what is your strategy and vision to assist small African companies become multi-sector and country leaders regionally in Africa? And how, in your opinion, can the World Bank Group partner with you and the private sector to scale that activity?
For the sake of time, I will not going to dwell too much. That just gives some insight of initiatives that we are undertaking. I recently, by the way, joined the African Development Bank. I was previously in Asia, covering former Soviet Union countries, Asia, and then some go for the Gulf countries. And I joined the African Development Bank recently to do some kind of innovative financing to sustain growth. And then the initiative that we launched and on which I will be providing some highlight is how the private sector can support inclusive growth by addressing the value chain. And the main actor of the value chain are SME and other companies. And these companies and the SMEs are across the border of formal and the real economy. We try to bring them back to the real economy. That's one. And there are other companies that we try to bring to be anchor enterprises, enterprises that will be active in the value chain by supporting large investment projects. This means what does mean? That means that we finance large projects like port, transport, rail, and things like that. But it doesn't bring really growth. Our experience is that that doesn't help so much. Also, we have tried in the past, like all multilateral, to do direct financing of SME through line of credits. That also did not bring too much effectiveness in and bring value to the chain of growth. Because most of us, we are doing it from line of credit to good banks, and then we don't want to take the risk in our portfolio for rating and other considerations. So we tried this initiative that consists of two components. A first component to address the funding, and the second component to address diversification of product, the market going cross-border and regional for some of the companies that we identify as potential growth anchor. For the funding, we do a special program to address the funding of SMEs, but special SMEs located in fragile state, post-conflict country where nobody wants to go and take the risk. We have, as multilateral, we have to be relevant. Then we have to provide this kind of funding to these SMEs. We do it through line of financing through tier 2 and 3 banks and private equity, but targeting essentially SMEs because we have very few private equity fund that does that, target agribusiness and so forth, and China debt and equity to SME. This is for the fragile state, but we have the big program which is called linkage program, SME linkage program, for large investment projects across sector, agribusiness, services, and so forth. That means what? That we categorize the companies that are operating locally into 2 groups. And we have an inclusive industry program, 1, and inclusive industry program 2. This program aims at at accompanying the large project we build infrastructure. For instance, we have a port in Nigeria. We try to identify the anchor company that can provide, be both supplier and off-taker of some of the activities of the port. Or we have large infrastructure combining mining, rail, and then port. I am not naming these because they are real projects that we finance, but we try to identify these enterprises and create a kind of program for them. And the program provides seed funding and also technical assistance. And it's more the technical assistance side on which we need cooperation because we create a seed fund program in order to be able to develop a number of things. We have in that area 6 pilot projects in mining, oil, and gas in order to reshape them a little bit and then develop the capacity, the finance, the management, and even the training of those doing operation and maintenance for electricity project. We also have the expansion of production and the supply of capacity, whereby we try to have some business model that allow them. We provide direct funding, equity, in this company in order to expand their production, diversify the market. But this has to be done through private credit bureau that we are setting that will monitor this company, and also rating, because these companies are not rated. They cannot go international. They even cannot go local because even local rating agencies are not. In order to look at their finance and then strengthen the way they structure the project, the way they can go through expansion, working closely hand on hand with them in order to grow. These are basically the 2 initiatives we have in place. I stop here for the sake of time in order to sustain growth in fragile states and also in, countries that are growing and have large infrastructure projects that we finance or co-finance with the World Bank and the other development finance institutions. So our intention is to expand the program for all development finance institutions, including the World Bank and IFC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khadija. Well, we'll go straight to OShea because he has some other commitments. So, OShea, would you share your experience in investing in this sector in Africa and your views on growing Africa's SME sector into large Pan-African regional companies? And how, in your opinion, can we partner with you and the private sector to scale up that activity?
Thank you very much. I think before I delve into this, maybe it's important I tell everyone what we do at the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. I'm the CEO of the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. It's a new organization founded about 2 years ago with a mandate to invest across 3 funds. One is a stabilization fund, the second is a future generations fund, and the third is an infrastructure fund focused on Nigeria. We decided within the infrastructure fund to focus on 6 areas, agriculture being one of those, motorways, power, gas processing and transport, healthcare, some of the key areas, and real estate as the 6 areas we wanted to invest in. Now, to your question, I think the first observation that we've had when we started was obviously the challenge of equity and having ample equity to grow these businesses. And that is something that I see as a challenge for most of the small and medium-scale enterprises that we have come across. The second thing is obviously what Jean-Philippe mentioned earlier, which is the cost and duration of debt, which remains an ongoing problem. I'm sure we all know this. Our experience, and we've made an investment, I think recently we've announced a commitment of $100 million in debt to a local gas processing and transportation company, which we hope will make that transition into something fairly large over time within Nigeria, while helping solve basic infrastructure issues like power. And we continue to look for such places where we can make investments where there's additionality, not just for the company, but in terms of what it solves for the country. My experience is obviously now in terms of how do you start to deal with the issue of the capital structure of these companies, both equity and debt. I think that before we delve into that, it's also good to acknowledge where we have come from. It's a good problem to have now that we can actually start to have a local private equity industry develop in places like Nigeria, which didn't exist 20 years ago. But I think that more can be done and more needs to be done. It is nice to see most African countries start to develop sovereign wealth funds, and those sovereign wealth funds, in my opinion, should take the lead in making investments in developing the local private equity market, because that's one way of trying to, over time, lowering the cost of capital for most of these companies. To that extent, at the NSIA, we've made 3 investments in private equity companies. We've invested in 2 that have significant exposure across Africa, and we've invested in the 3rd one that is focused on agriculture within Nigeria, and we continue to look for more opportunities of such. I think, number one, that is the first key building block in trying to help small and medium-scale enterprises access the kind of capital they need that helps, in my opinion, to start to build the businesses. Because the good thing about having that industry developed is that it also helps businesses have the right governance, have the right structures, the right operations to prepare themselves for growth. Listen, when you go through Nigeria and look at most of the companies, a lot of them are very successful doing simple little things. But it takes a lot of structure to build your business for growth. You can't handle growth if you don't have the right building blocks in place. So I think it's very important that you have this source of capital, because it brings other benefits, which is in restructuring the businesses and making them ready and prepare them for growth. So we've seen a few of these type of businesses. I expect that these things start to grow. And as African countries mature into being able to aggregate their capital and use it more effectively, this is an industry that needs support. The second thing is deepening the source of capital for most of these companies. It is no coincidence that the most developed capital market in Africa is in South Africa, and that coincides also with the fact that you have most of the top 100 businesses that are large. It could be coincidental, it could be causative, who knows, but the point is that the two are closely interlinked. So when you look at a place like Nigeria, for example, a lot of the companies that reflect the economy are not in the capital market. How do you deepen the capital market if these companies are not participating? They must participate, because over time you start to see that it starts to create a network effect where more companies go into the market, the more people have confidence in the market, the more the market is attractive for small and medium-scale businesses to go into the market. Something must break. I have no policy view as to how this happens, but it's something that must happen. Companies that represent the economy in a place like Nigeria, for example, be it in telecoms, be it in oil and gas, be it in manufacturing, must make its way to the market, because that creates a network effect that makes it easy for smaller companies to get involved. And so when we meet companies and we have conversations with them, one of the things we encourage them to do is, have you looked at the capital markets? Yes, NSIA may not invest in you directly. We're investing in funds that will invest in you. We've had 1 or 2. One major one that we have invested directly in a company, but it's about how do you deepen that market. The third thing is, obviously, people will always point to the fact that legal and regulatory environments still remain challenging, and people, as a consequence, do not access these markets as effectively. I think that is an ongoing complaint, but it's also evolved, in my opinion. Today, the listing requirements in a place like Nigeria has improved substantially, and we continue to observe that across the board, this is what most African countries are doing. So what is our experience? It's very simple, and I'll leave it at 3 points. Number one, it's what I said earlier. Investing in and developing the local private equity company industry will, in my opinion, go a long way in giving them the right kind of capital they need, the right type of duration, and helping them in preparing their businesses for growth. We must try and encourage that the local capital market continues to deepen. And here is a role I believe all of us on this table and most sovereign wealth funds will play a role in helping that happen. Now, let me talk about the World Bank Group, which is the last part of your question, John Philippe. We have had an extensive experience with IFC We have actually an MOU with IFC where we compare pipelines. The investment we made, obviously, in the gas processing company I'm talking about, IFC is also an investor. We've worked with them extensively in our infrastructure fund, in our motorways investments, and other areas of our infrastructure fund. All in all, I think it's been an excellent experience. The one thing that I observe, and this is where they have been of tremendous help, is when it comes to infrastructure investing, which is obviously the next key step in growing businesses across Africa, the biggest challenge I see is project preparation. There are three roles a company like the NSIA can play. We can invest, we can co-develop, we can sponsor deals. Frankly, I don't like the last two. I don't like to sponsor, I don't like to co-develop, I like to just invest. But the reality is that most projects that come to us are not well prepared, and so we find ourselves backward integrating into trying to prepare them. Technical assistance in getting those projects to the point where we can invest in them simply is very essential. We've had this conversation last year at this table, and I kept saying this is where the problem is. Motorways are an excellent investment in a place like Nigeria. There is a road, Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. Terrible as it is, still carries 120,000 cars per day. Needs to be put on the market, needs to be one that is done as a PPP, but the preparatory work is extensive. And this is where I think across the board you see this. You see this in power, you see this in gas, you see this in healthcare. Project preparation makes a lot of difference. It takes time, it takes effort, but more importantly, it takes expertise. And this is where I think more can be done and more is expected from the World Bank Group in getting this to go. The second is obviously making sure it's easier for people to access the insurance programs. You have partial risk guarantees and all these things that MIGA does. Our experience, and Jean-Philippe, I'll give this to you as a feedback. Our experience has been that most people complain about how difficult and how long it takes to access this. My sense is that more can be done, but so far I think our experience with the IFC and the World Bank Group has been excellent. But again, we're never satisfied, we expect more. But thank you very much, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Uche. Hendrik, would you share with us your views on investment that potentially assist to take African companies regional, and how, in your opinion, can the World Bank Group partner with you and the private sector to scale that activity?
Thank you very much, and I'll try not to repeat what Uche gave a very good framework of how one should invest in these companies and think. But I'd like to start at the other end, because I'm a business person. I once, many, many years ago, was an economist and then tried to be a development economist. I'm now an investor and a business person. So the story I'd like to tell is the story of a few companies which have made it. And during that story, I'd wanted to think about the classic SME rhetoric. We often confuse venture capital with SME development, and we forget the development that we need, the examples of winning businesses in all markets. Why has South Africa got 88 of the biggest? Because there are examples around clustering benefits. Standards are set. When there are some winners, and you've seen it in Nigeria of late as businesses have come through and scaled up, and I think the Dangote Group is one great example which gives ambition to a region, which gives ambition to a place, and other businesses to grow. So I would suggest from a World Bank Group and IFC point of view, you are big and you are big ticket players, and I think it's time we develop the big ticket as well, and not just the politically popular small, because you need them actually to spawn and support the small. What would Korea have been without the Kai ball? The Korean government's trying to beat up the Kai ball for the last 15 years, if you read the local press. Samsung just keeps growing. But look at all those other businesses and the skills and the clustering stuff that's created. If you go and look at the work Ricardo Hausman does at Harvard, which is all about skills development in an economy, you'll see that clustering is incredibly powerful. So that's the first point. Second point, the story I want to tell you. Story of our business. I mean, we compete today globally. We started in one city, in one country as a startup, and we're the first of our kind, the first money management business of our kind, the first integrated financial group of our kind to have grown the way we've done from a developing market basis and actually effectively competing outside. And I think there are many such examples across Africa, regionally or globally. I mean, the Safaricoms in Kenya, Dangote Group is only starting. It just has so many opportunities in Nigeria. But the company I'd like to mention as a poster child, because it is in our private equity portfolio. I have to declare my interest. But many other, as with a good kid, all the uncles and aunts and everyone all claim that they helped develop the kid, the grandmothers, the father, mother, all of them. So IHS, a Nigerian company, when our private equity guys brought them to me, it was Isham Darwish and his people, a small Nigerian towers company with inadequate reporting, pretty entrepreneurial management, rather weak structures and systems, but they had what it took. They had that drive and that ability. And we, along with a number of other private equity groups, invested in them. Today you have, and I think when we invested, and Chris Dirksen is in the audience here who helped do that transaction, I think they had 500 or 600 towers. Today they have 20,000 towers either co-owned or managed. And so they are the biggest mobile telephone tower business, i.e. kind of real estate business of their kind in Africa. They've acquired towers from most of the African or large telecom operators, which you've got to run to your meeting, so right, no problem. They will probably by the end of the year have, we estimate, an enterprise value of $3 billion, which is equity plus debt. Investors around the world that they've attracted, if I look at the names, Wendell Group from France, Goldman Sachs, a whole lot of top-end private equity and DFI investors, and it's only the beginning. Now, those are the examples I think we must focus more on in our support. And how are we going to focus on them? Do what Uchi said, local capital market deepening. And I think the academic literature and the practical development of local capital market tends to go around regulation and things like that, rather than how can this capital market serve the economy and the companies. And I'd like to leave it there and say capital market development, regional simplicity, allowing companies to go cross-border, and then generally creating a culture where we celebrate that success rather than negative about it. Because we as Africans are very good at, a bit like the Australians, when a poppy gets tall, we try to take the tall poppy out. And I think if we can take a lesson from this country, they celebrate the success, and that's why they create so much success. And that's where I'd like to end. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Henry. Savannah, as a women-led business owner in the infrastructure sector operating across Africa, tell us about your business and the role you would like to see the World Bank take in supporting creation of this new generation of large companies. And how, in your opinion, can the World Bank Group partner with you and the private sector to scale that activity? So when I say you'd like to see the World Bank, I meant the World Bank Group. Sorry.
Thank you, Jean-Philippe. Our company, Bonengi, is working across the African continent as a developer of projects in infrastructure, natural resources, and in agriculture. We also own the largest construction company in the continent, and it's listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which is always interesting to have women in construction, but there you go. When we talk about what we do, one of the things we realized once we were very successful in construction was Africa has a lot of projects, but someone's got to invest and take the risk in making those projects actually bankable, which was what Uchi was talking about. So we decided to develop a company that develops projects and takes the risk up front to be able to do the studies, to actually make the projects fundable. Because in the infrastructure class, you'll appreciate that it's always been seen as unfundable or very difficult to put together any kind of structure. And so we work in these three sectors, and we build ports, we build roads, we build railways, energy projects. We are in gold and copper and iron ore, in tin and coal. We grow bananas, tomatoes, and macadamia nuts. And we're also in cement. And the thing that we are finding is there are many projects, but not all projects are bankable. And so our job becomes, how do you choose the best projects to be able to make bankable, number one. Number two, how do you work with governments that really do want to develop? One of the things that we were very surprised about is it takes so long to be able to get projects to close. And one assumes that in countries where there's such an opportunity for development, governments would welcome people like us with open arms and really ensure that those lead times are short. Well, this is not a fact. So we have come to understand that Also, as African governments, we're probably the only businesses, we're based in South Africa but operate throughout the continent. We're the only private businesses that don't have our governments come with us when we want to invest across our own continent. So when we come to Tanzania or to Ghana or to Angola, we find the Germans, and the German government is there with their German banks. We find the Chinese are there with their Chinese banks, supporting those companies, ensuring that those companies are successful. We're on our own, and yet we're trying to stimulate businesses that are African. Our banks, we are the third in line when we're looking for funding, and yet with these other countries, their banks are talking to the politicians. Now, I've spoken to a few presidents in the continent to try and find out what the problem is, and their biggest position is they're quite concerned that when they come with their companies, it's always seen as corruption when it's African businesses, and it's never seen as actually promoting businesses in Africa. But it's a challenge because if we are going to grow companies that operate across the continent, there has to be participation from Africans. To be able to ensure that business is sustainable, there has to be involvement of Africans and of women. So you asked the question, Chair, of what do we believe the World Bank should be doing? The first thing is training. We find that when we are dealing with our government partners, some of the challenges that make the projects, the infrastructure ones to be specific, and agriculture to take such a long time to close is, on our negotiating side, on the other side, there's very little experience of what is private equity and how does project finance work and how do you put together a PPP that's effective and what are the laws that will be able to govern that particular project so that the government wins, the country wins, but also the investor wins. Also, we would like the World Bank to be able to really encourage governments to understand that as the developer and the funder, we are taking the biggest risk. So governments need to be reasonable in the shareholding that they require to participate in these jobs, because sometimes they require such high shareholding that the jobs then no longer really are profitable, and then the investor sort of walks away and the developer thinks, well, you know what, we cannot participate in this environment, and really the country loses. We also think that it would be a great position for the World Bank to really work with governments to figure out how to harmonize commercial law. How do you get the law that's happening in Uganda to be similar commercially to that's happening in Tanzania? If we're going to be able to really talk about significant, high impact intra-trading and growth in the continent, the legal environment is very critical. It must be harmonized, it must have similarities, and people need to be able to know that if we're going to invest, the investment is as safe as investment can be because there's legal protection, and that the capacity to repatriate money is similar, because that is very important to an investor, to be able to repatriate money to the source or to the funder that has invested in the project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Savannah. Last but not least, Alex. You are at the forefront of youth development and innovation at Viacom. What are your views on Africa's media and entertainment industries and opportunities for African entrepreneurs to potentially grow into large Pan-African entertainment and new media businesses? And how, in your opinion, can the World Bank Group partner with you and the private sector to scale that activity?
I hope everyone is listening because it's the sexiest conversation. With a sexy voice as well. So,
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I said I hope everyone is listening because this is a very sexy topic, talking about media and entertainment in Africa. And I am privileged to be here. Of course, development and infrastructure development is very, very critical to Africa. However, I think that the focus on some of those sectors, especially those that don't involve the creative space or the entertainment space, has really been a detriment to the continent, to be quite frank. However, it is an exciting time based on innovations, not only in the content creation, but on the platform space. Africa is now in a position where we are telling our own stories, and we also want to consume our own stories, which is a very, very, very important evolution to the space. There are, of course, many advantages of the media and entertainment space in Africa. It is one where understanding that a large proportion of the young people that make up a large proportion of the continent are very attracted to the sector is definitely a place where you can create a lot of jobs. It does foster education and more importantly, provides a great platform for change in perceptions globally about our continent. Yes, we do have a young continent. The time for, again, looking at the sector in a much more serious way is now better than ever before. Based on more macroeconomic forces such as more stable governments, the regulation and privatization in this sector is really spurring a lot of growth. At the same time, it does provide opportunities like our company at Viacom. As Viacom, I represent a whole bunch of brands that we've launched into Africa. We started, of course, with our MTV brand as a case study. We looked at Africa. The investment idea was not to approach Africa in the way that we approached launching an MTV channel, for instance, in Europe, where you would put a channel together and you get the content. For us, we had to look at it differently. How do we foster how do we actually help to create the content from that perspective? How do we actually form part of the supply chain for the content that we need to place on our channel? So we had to do a lot of development, build capacity. We had to train people. We had to train young people, the producers, the directors, the musicians, on how to create better content. Of course, it helped us create a unique proposition for our brand, but more importantly, it helped to actually elevate the creative landscape on that front, which has been very, very powerful in what you see today. In the music front, for instance, African music is traveling not only across Africa, but obviously into the other parts of the world now. A quick anecdote, a friend of mine whose daughter is going to school and went to a party at MIT was there and saying that they're listening to African music at MIT and they're dancing to African music, which I think is quite powerful if you look at the opportunity that does exist within the music sector, even for people that want to invest in it. So from a standpoint of what's possible and what opportunities exist, 2015 is an important year for media in Africa as analog to digital migration is going to take place in the TV space. It does lend itself to a lot of investment opportunities for any entrepreneur that wants to invest in that space. If you look at the music front, based on the music that's traveling across Africa now into the other parts of the world, entrepreneurs that can find a way not only to monetize but to also distribute the music, obviously untraditionally to what's happening in the music distribution market in the US, for instance, can definitely capture value from that space. If you look in the pay TV side, for instance, a lot of companies are investing. Yes, there's a lot of success that one can find behind the multi-choice story or the NASPA story in Africa, but new companies are investing. I think it's great to see, for instance, the Wenatchee Group in the second round of funding get $135 million to continue to expand their business on the continent. So I think there's a variety of different opportunities that exist in the sector of media and entertainment, and I think in that light, it is an area that the bank should focus on and look at how it can support its development. Of course, there can be a fund created by the IFC, for instance, to kind of enable entrepreneurs that want to go into the space, because it's not as easy to articulate the media and entertainment space. It's not as tangible as others. To be able to create and also foster the growth of the industry. A fund like that, well managed, and obviously, provides access to a lot of investors who want to get into the space. And I think more importantly, the bank can also work with governments to really work on how can we, provide a framework for protecting the intellectual property, which oftentimes is the real value that's traded when you're media and entertainment. If that doesn't happen, it doesn't necessarily, it's not going to help the growth of the sector. But if the bank can work with governments in being able to put together such frameworks, it will really do it would be a huge benefit to being able to grow the sector. I think the bank can also really, really, play a huge part in helping governments to understand, and their banking partners, more importantly, to understand how to lend to this sector, and to be able to train people on what, and banks on how the value of the sector, because it is a very valuable sector to focus on. It is very attractive to the continent, the young people that we have. So I think that, the bank can really play a crucial role in doing that.
All right, thank you very much. I know some of my colleagues have to leave, and we have some time constraints. I don't know, any guidance from the organizers? 3 questions. All right. 2 questions.
Very good.
This lady. Okay, good. Please, go ahead, ma'am.
My name is Farida Naborema, and my question goes to many African companies, especially the SMEs, have to compete with large multinational corporations that are already grounded on the continent. So what do you do to increase the competitiveness of these SMEs so that they can be able to have their goods and services match the prices of these MNCs that have been doing the businesses on the continent for generations and generations? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take the second question. So, one question. One question twice. One question that just one question. Mrs. Diallo, you have the floor.
Yeah, and then you will complement.
Oh, oh.
Because we have a similar experience. Yeah, the issue is they have 2 problems. The first one, quality and branding. Second, cost of production. That's very important. The costs tend to be high, so that's reduce the competitiveness vis-a-vis the. And then also the information for market penetration, either it's in the region or, I mean, the country or in the region. So what we do, essentially, we retool them. We have technical assistance fund to address different components of the problematic. The problematic is not the same across, I mean, it depends on the countries and then depend on the type of sector they operate. We try to retool them. We try also to restructure, to give them a training program to enhance their capacity, and also to provide more information for them, and then channel them toward the market niches where they can stand more competitive. I mean, where they can hold more competitive position. But it's really, it takes time. It's not easy. It is part of our mandate, but it's time consuming, and only multilateral lender can afford doing that. But if we joint effort with the others, IFC, and then maybe project development company to make some of the project bankable, I think it can help. But how concretely to go to that stage from this panel is something we need to think about, because it's a concrete proposal, how to network to build a better capacity of these SMEs. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just bring an additional perspective? I think with Ms. Diallo's job and what she explained is perfectly correct and should be done. But I would like to encourage the World Bank Group to think slightly differently, because I know no business which can win against its competitors by trying to get support to do exactly the same thing. You have to encourage entrepreneurs to think differently, create an environment where people understand implicitly business. I mean, how can a Kenyan street corner foreign exchange dealer be competitive? Well, he speaks 3 languages, he's very fast, and he takes huge margins when he changes your dollars for whatever currency you want. And it's just different because they approach his business. And if we look at African people's ability to do business, our ability across Africa is not to be the cheapest labor force in the world, but we have very flexible, very friendly, very fast-moving, very adaptable people. And we have not exploited that. And I think that is where the multilateral institutions can start thinking. It's thinking business rather than thinking getting government to help a business, because government will never help business except in 2 areas, and the one you're in and you're doing an exceptional job is infrastructure, and the other one is policy making, which you're also already doing a good job. So we can't give you advice on that.
All right. Well, listen, I won't add much. I mean, I would agree with both what both people have said. Have some components. I mean, some truth in each of them. Personally, and as I think as an institution also, we believe that the role of government is it's really a facilitator. I mean, government are not entrepreneurs. Let's face it, they are just facilitator. So which means they have to put the proper framework in place, regulations, all these. And that's why we, I would say, if I take the World Bank Group, and when we work with government, at least I can say for IFC, definitely in our advice to government, that's what we focus on. How to help them improve the business environment. So to facilitate, you know, and then the rest will be indeed for entrepreneurs to try to take those kind of risks. Now, as Ms. Jallo said, indeed they need training, they need support. You can do all kind of capacity building, or you can do whatever you want. However, I think there are two things that are extremely important. I think we definitely need large African companies. Why? One of the reasons is that when you help, for example, as IFC, when we work with large companies, the idea is not just to support the large companies, because at the end of the day, sometimes they might be able to find the money somewhere else. We are not there to do what others can do. But we try to look to the value chain and see how through these companies we will eventually be able to help the SME, the small and medium companies. Because those small and medium companies, they can't export today because they don't have all of these. However, when they can sell to those large Pan-African companies, those large companies. So it's extremely important for the small and medium companies to have those large companies as, you know, their clients, so they can build their own business, and eventually one day they will become big. But anyway, we don't have much time to get into all of those discussions, but I just wanted to add that. So thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.